Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Bone. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I add to the praise that's been heaped on the Honourable Member for Worthing West and my Honourable Friend, the Member for Poplar and Limehouse, and indeed LKP and everyone who's involved in the APPG. As we've already seen, this debate encompasses an extremely wide range of issues, not least the scandal which so many of my honourable friends have spoke so passionately about, but also many other issues that affect my constituents, from the need for greater transparency when it comes to service charges, to the huge problems many of them face when trying to rectify damages caused by accidents such as flooding, a relatively simple thing you might think. But today I want to focus on just one pressing issue which is of great concern to hundreds and hundreds of my constituents. And doing so, I build on the comments made by my honourable friend, my constituency neighbour, and the honourable member for Brentford and Isleworth, and that is the issue of liability for the costs associated with interim safety measures and remedial fire safety works on private freehold developments. In the wake of June's horrific Grenfell Tower inferno, 3 private freehold developments in my constituency failed cladding tests arranged through the department. The Babbage Point development on Norman Road and 2 blocks on the new Capitol Quay development, all in West Greenwich. And I'm going to run through in a little bit of detail the case of the latter to illustrate what is a far wider problem. Now, New Capitol Quay is a new build development that was completed in 2013-14. It comprises of a total of 980 mixed tenure homes, 658 of which are private. The freeholder is RomeQuest Limited, but the immediate parent company is Galliard Holding Limited, and the ultimate holding company is Galliard Group Limited. So despite the somewhat opaque nature of the ownership structure, this is a Galliard development, as both the company structure and all of the publicity around it indicate. In the immediate aftermath of Grenfell, a 24/7 Waking Watch fire marshal patrol was instituted across the whole development on the basis of consultation with and guidance from the London Fire Brigade. That was followed in September by the issue of a notice of deficiencies. And while I have no accurate figures about the total costs associated with both measures, I would estimate they are likely to run into the hundreds of thousands, if not ultimately millions of pounds. And residential leaseholders on the development and shared owners, scores of whom have contacted me over recent months, are extremely concerned that these costs will simply be passed on to them by Galliard. And they've got good reason to be worried. In the case of any normal leasehold flat or house, leaseholders are required to pay for the repairs that the lease says they're responsible for, while the freeholder is responsible for structural repairs. But when it comes to ACM cladding, the material is not actually out of repair. It's just incredibly dangerous. And therefore, I think there's every reason to believe that their replacement won't be categorised on private freehold developments as an improvement, as a repair, but as an improvement or a renewal. And that is the position that Galliard, who by happy coincidence replied to my representation some time ago on behalf of residents, through their legal representatives yesterday, have adopted. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's absolutely plain as day that given the unique circumstances post-Grenfell, there's going to be real legal complexity in terms of the recovery of costs associated with both the interim safety measures and any long-term remedial works on developments such as these. And in each case, of course, it will depend clearly on the leasing question. But I think in many cases, freeholders will simply attempt to recover them from leaseholders, or where they can't, find ways to avoid paying the costs entirely. For example, by creating a dormant company with no assets and simply then throwing up their hands, as I think has been the case in one example in Slough. As honourable members will be aware, some freeholders, to their credit, as my honourable friend mentioned, are shouldering the costs of post-Grenfell remedial fire safety works themselves as a gesture of goodwill. But that is, as she rightly said, an exception rather than the rule. And I suspect that most will not follow Legal and General's lead, despite the government's urging that they do so. And while that might be disappointing, it's also entirely unsurprising, because it is a voluntary action they've taken. And why would any developer or private landlord, from their point of view, voluntarily give a gift, in a sense, or cover the cost for leaseholders in such a way if they're in a position to evade that responsibility? And in the case of New Capitol Quay, Galliard maintained that they were fully compliant with the building regulations at the time the development was completed, that the construction was signed off by an approved inspector, and that as such they shouldn't be liable for the fact that they are now not compliant. Mr. Bone, the whole situation is a complete and utter mess. But the important point, I think, at a human level, and the crux of the issue, is that the cost of these works resulting from what has emerged in the wake of Grenfell, costs which could run into the tens of thousands of pounds for each individual leaseholder, cannot justifiably be recovered from them. The 658 leaseholders on New Capitol Quay and the scores of shared owners as well bought their properties in good faith and bear no responsibility whatsoever for failures in the building regulations regime. But as things stand, they are going to be absolutely clobbered. Now, some will no doubt be affluent enough to afford the costs that might come down the line, but many will not be, and they'll suffer real hardship as a result. But in either case, it's neither fair nor reasonable. And from what I've seen, there are no effective means of redress through either claims to the NHBC or in terms of the advice and support that Lease are offering. This is a really serious problem, the extent of which I don't think has yet been grasped by government, and ministers need to give it more consideration and more thoughtful attention than they've done so far. And I look forward very much to hearing the ministers' advice to my constituents who are affected and who, as things stand, are extremely worried about what the future holds for them.
Yeah.